what we've learnt through the pandemic that will be relevant post-pandemic if we reach a point where we can begin to talk about post-pandemic. But the main thing, the main point is that I want to address is what have we learnt? What are some lessons that we've learnt as educators through the pandemic? And I want to focus on only four things that I think we've learnt. No doubt there are many more, but I just want to focus on these four. And when I say things that we've learnt, in another sense, that's not true. They're not things that we've learnt for the first time. It might be more correct to say that these are things that we've been reminded of through the pandemic, that have been brought into sharper focus, if you like, through the pandemic. The first thing I wanted to say something about is the pandemic has reminded us that students have very different needs, very different general needs, very different learning needs. In our schools, and I'm speaking internationally now, in our schools, we often adopt the approach of trying to treat every student in the same way, trying to treat all students equally. And often we think that's because that's the fair thing to do. Teach them exactly the same curriculum, have them all start learning that curriculum at the same time, give them the same amount of time to learn the curriculum, the content of the curriculum, assess them using the same instruments or methods, report their performance in the same way. So the intention is to treat students equally. And I think what the pandemic has really driven home is that students' experiences during the pandemic were very different. This is an observation that's being made internationally. Some students struggled and were very adversely impacted by the advent of the pandemic. Others appeared to have been less adversely impacted. But the point I'm making is that it has reminded us, the pandemic has reminded us that students' experiences are very different. The learning loss, if you want to talk in those terms, that has occurred as a result of the pandemic is different for different students. Students have had differing levels of support in their learning when they have not been in school. So certainly in the countries that I'm familiar with, some students have been better supported. Families have been able to provide better support. That some families have been able to provide better support than others. So the general point is that students have very different needs. And as students returned to school, the important point is learning loss, yes, but maybe even more important than learning loss is understanding where individual learners are in their learning at that point of returning to school. What do they know? What do they understand? What can they do? What are the next steps in their learning? What can we do to support individuals? So rather than just assuming that all students are now at the same point in their learning and we can teach them the same things, it's become even more important as a result of the pandemic that we go to the trouble of establishing and understanding where individuals are up to in their learning, and then thinking about, as I say, how we can best support the further learning of every student. And so, if you like, teaching then becomes much more than just delivering the curriculum. A very important aspect of teaching is understanding students, understanding as I say, their starting points, understanding their backgrounds, their interests, their motivations, difficulties they may be experiencing. Teaching is a much more difficult and much more professional task than simply delivering a curriculum that somebody has provided. It really requires, as I say, going to the trouble of diagnosing, of understanding starting points, and then designing teaching and interventions to address students' varying needs. So that's my first point. The pandemic has reminded us that students have very different needs. They're at very different points in their learning, maybe even more so as a result of the experience of the pandemic. The second thing I think the pandemic has reminded us is that learning can occur anywhere, anytime. Again, we tend in our schools, in our formal educational institutions, to structure learning around places, around time periods. So we have classrooms, we have timetables, school timetables, semesters, school years. So the institutional structure of education, of learning, imposes these constraints on time, on place. And I think one of the things the pandemic broke open, in a sense, in many countries was this recognition that people can learn anywhere at any time. And we learnt the same thing, by the way, when it comes to work. Many of us would not have predicted, I think, that people could work, many people could work just as effectively from home as they could from the office. And they could work in different time periods as well. So recognising that learning can occur anywhere, anytime. And I think as a result, the pandemic has encouraged us to think less about the formal structures of institutions, the formal business of schooling, and to focus more on learning itself. Learning as a process that transcends institutions, really. We divide learning up into chunks. We divide learning up into convenient modules and organise teaching and learning that way. But really, learning is ideally a continuous, ongoing, potentially lifelong process. And when you see learning from that perspective, it becomes clearer that the institutions that we've developed, stages of schooling, phases of schooling, transitions between phases and so on, these are really artificial impositions on what ideally would be a continuous, cumulative process that could occur anywhere, anytime. And of course, technology has played an important role in many countries in enabling learning to occur more flexibly in terms of place and time. The third point, third thing I think we've had reinforced through the pandemic is the importance of paying attention to students' social and emotional well-being. Obviously, many students were very significantly and sadly impacted by the pandemic. Many will be impacted for life by what's happened over the last couple of years. Mental health has been affected for many students. Now, we've always known and have always said that schools have a role to play in ensuring the social development of young people, the emotional development of young people. But I think the pandemic, as I say, has really sharpened this up for us and made it even clearer that this is more than just something you need to get in place so that you can get on with the main job, if that's the way you see it, of academic learning. I was in a meeting actually earlier today, an international meeting online, where the argument was being made that students' social and emotional learning is now as important as their academic learning. It needs to be built into the curriculum. It needs to be prioritised to the same level as we have historically prioritised academic learning. So, of course, there are programs, there are assessments that people are developing to look at health and well-being in these areas. Being out of school in many countries, students were not able to interact and socialise, and we realised that school, if we didn't already realise, we realised what an important role schools play in the social development of young people as well. So I think the pandemic has reinforced that. It's reinforced the importance of paying attention to mental health, paying attention to things like resilience, doing what we can as educators to support young people in their learning and in their development. And then the fourth thing I think that has become clearer is that if you are to do all these things, if you are to better identify and meet the needs of individual learners, if you are to recognise that learning can take place more flexibly in terms of time and place, that you can have blended arrangements, for example, where there's some face-to-face and some online learning. And if you recognise the importance of young people's social and emotional learning and development, that has obvious implications for us as educators, for classroom teachers. There's a whole, I don't know if it's new, but an important set of skills in doing all those things, in identifying where individuals are at, understanding their starting points, meeting them at their points of need, including their social and emotional needs. So it has implications for teachers, it has implications for professional learning, probably has implications for initial teacher education as well. And more generally, I guess what the pandemic has helped us see as well is that this is not just the responsibility of schools. In many countries, parents became suddenly much more involved in their children's learning. Parents and others became much more involved. And so we've said for many, many years that it takes a village to raise a child and that learning is everybody's business. But I think through the pandemic, this became much clearer for us in many countries, that there is a role that the community can play more generally, that the learning and well-being of young people is not something that can be left entirely to schools to occur, behind classroom doors. It's a much bigger agenda than that.